You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you are listening to your favorite international podcast.
Thank you so much to everyone who is leaving us reviews and ratings. We're getting really close to my personal goal of 1,000 ratings on iTunes USA. We appreciate it so much. Thank you. Also, if you could keep voting for us in the podcast magazine Hot 50 charts, that would be super. That's Johanna's goal. It's important to have goals. These are ours. They're modest, but achievable, right? So if you just go to podcastmagazine.com/hot50, you will be able to vote for your top 3 podcasts. And if you could please vote for Fresh Hell Podcast, hosted by Annie and Johanna, or Johanna and Annie, however you want to say it, we would be so grateful.
Yes. Annie's goal is 1,000 ratings, and my goal is us being in the top 10 at least once.
It's going to happen.
And we know how amazing our listeners are in supporting this podcast, and you can do it. I believe in you. No, seriously, you have no idea how grateful we are.
We just appreciate you so much. All right.
I'd say let's get right into today's episode. In the last 3 weeks, we discussed 2 horrific murders, one of them unsolved, and so it's time for one of our palate cleanser episodes. So this one will be a little bit chattier and more lighthearted, I'd say. If that's not your cup of poison, that's of course totally fine. Just sit this one out.
There are a lot of corpses in today's episode, though.
There are a lot of corpses.
I mean, it's a little lighter, but also there are a lot of corpses.
And also the death of animals.
Oh, yeah, I think it's going to be okay, though. It's only mentioned very vaguely.
Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah.
If we think it's okay, I think that you guys will be okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, what are we going to discuss today? Well, we thought it's about time for a bit of macabre and a bit of spooky fuckery. I don't think we have talked about vampires yet, have we?
I don't think they've had their own whole episode, right? The New England Vampire Panic is on the list, and I think we were planning a kind of a fun vampire science episode for October, but no, I don't think we have done a dedicated vampire episode.
Exactly. And that's why we thought it was about time, and therefore we would love to present to you the Highgate Vampire. So this all takes place in one of London's cemeteries. We talked about an equal cemetery, or a very similar cemetery, when we discussed the London funeral train.
Yes, the London Necropolis Railway that took coffins and grieving people to Brookwood Cemetery. So interesting.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
There are so many interesting cemeteries all over this planet. I do love cemeteries. Whenever we travel to a new city, I'm drawn to the graveyards. And if I remember correctly, you feel the same way, right?
I do. I absolutely love them. I love old cemeteries. Yeah. So we just mentioned Brookwood Cemetery, which is located outside London. But today we are talking about another one of the Magnificent Seven, Highgate Cemetery.
For those of you who don't know, the Magnificent Seven refers to the 7 large cemeteries in and around London that were opened in the Victorian era. So that's Chancel Green Cemetery that opened in 1833, West Norwood Cemetery 1837, Highgate, the west side of the Highgate Cemetery opened in 1839 and the east side in 1860, Abney Park Cemetery 1840, Brompton Cemetery and Nunhead Cemetery the same year, Tower Hamlet Cemetery in 1841. You see, Brookwood Cemetery, that was, I think, as I remember correctly, the largest cemetery in the world at the time, is not even part of the Magnificent Seven, right? But Highgate Cemetery is.
That's right. This burial ground was opened in 1839, so 10 years before Brookwood Cemetery. The city of London was basically overflowing with graves at that time. London was, of course, the largest city in the world with 2 million inhabitants in 1831 and steadily growing. Living conditions were very bad for most people in the city, who had no access to fresh, clean water, no sewage system, no trash collection. There were narrow streets with crammed living quarters, terrible air pollution, and all of this caused a high death toll. Cholera outbreaks were very common, and so many people died and were buried wherever there was a place to put them. which of course caused even more health and hygiene problems. So huge cemeteries outside of the city were opened, and one of them was Highgate. And again, we're not getting too much into this because we did speak in depth about this background in episode 47, which was Victorian Death Trip 2, Bring Out Your Dead. Yeah, now we're going to get on to Highgate, which of course opened in 1839 and became one of the most requested burial grounds for all the wealthiest people of London soon after. From the official webpage about Highgate, which is highgatecemetery.org, they write, quote, "On Monday, 20 May, 1839, the cemetery was dedicated to St. James by the Right Reverend Charles James Blomfield, Lord Bishop of London. 15 acres were consecrated for the use of members of the Church of England, and 2 acres set aside for dissenters, people who were not Church of England. Rights of burial were granted for either a limited period or in perpetuity. The first burial on 26 May 1839 was Elizabeth Jackson, aged 36, of Little Windmill Street, Soho. The unparalleled elevation overlooking London, rising to 375 feet above sea level at its highest point, along with its unique architecture, meant that the wealthy would be encouraged to invest. The millionaire newspaper owner Julius Beer was one such investor, who built the cemetery's most impressive monument to his 8-year-old daughter, Ada." The website goes on to say, the architectural highlights. 2 chapels, one for the Church of England and the other for dissenters, were housed within one building, built in the Tudor Gothic style, topped with wooden turrets and a central bell tower. The archway beneath the bell tower gives an imposing entry to the cemetery. In the heart of the grounds was created the Egyptian Avenue, an imposing structure consisting of 16 vaults on either side of a broad passageway entered via a great arch. These vaults were fitted with shelves for 12 coffins and were purchased by individual families for their sole use. This avenue then led to the Circle of Lebanon, which was built in the same style and consisted of 20 vaults on the inner circle, with a further 16 added in the 1870s, built in the classical style. The circle was created by earth being excavated around an ancient cedar of Lebanon, a legacy of the Ashurst estate, and was used to great visual effect by the cemetery's designers. Above this, a separate Gothic-style catacomb, named the Terrace Catacombs, as they would say in England, due to its position on the site of the earlier terrace of Ashurst House, was completed in 1842. This was built with an impressive 80-yard frontage and room for a total of 825 people and 55 vaults of 15 loculi each localus being sold individually to house one coffin. These were typical of the fashion for above-ground burial." End quote. Yeah, these cemeteries are really cool because I think it's going to be similar to the one that I went to in Greyfriars when we were in Edinburgh, but you're almost in like a city. The way you are in New Orleans, you know, when you walk around and there's like little houses because the graves are above ground. It's similar to that where you feel like you're in a little city inside a cemetery. Pretty soon, as many as 30 burials a day were taking place at Highgate. In total, 170,000 people were buried there in 53,000 graves. And of course, many famous and infamous people found their last resting spot there. I think one of the most famous might be Karl Marx, but there are more. The author George Eliot, also known as Mary Ann Evans. I really hated the book Silas Marner the first time I read it. Friends, should I reread it? Also buried there was poet Christina Rossetti and the surgeon Henry Gray of Gray's Anatomy, as well as scientist Michael Faraday.
So over the decades, the longing for elaborate gravesites disappeared. The Victorian death cult, if you want to call it that way, was no longer fashionable, and Highgate fell a bit in, I don't want to say disarray, because the gardeners did their best to keep the grounds immaculate, but people forgot a little bit about Highgate. Less and less people wanted to be laid to rest there, and so in 1960, the cemetery's gates closed. And they would have stayed closed forever if it wouldn't have been for the Friends of Highgate Cemetery. They took it upon themselves to raise funds for renovation and upkeep of the graves and grounds. Again, from the official webpage, quote, "In 1975, the Friends of Highgate Cemetery was formed with the aim to, quote, promote the conservation of the cemetery, its monuments and buildings, flora and fauna for the benefit of the public as an environmental amenity, end quote. Work began to clear through the overgrown landscape and repair some of the memorials which had been damaged by vandals during the cemetery's decline. Since then, an increasing amount of restoration and conservation work has been carried out. The Egyptian Avenue, Circle of Lebanon, and the Terrace Catacomb, along with over 70 other monuments, have now been listed by English Heritage, with over double that number having had expert attention and maintenance. During 2011, the chapel interior was restored to its 1880s color scheme and reopened for funerals. English Heritage has listed Highgate Cemetery as a Grade 1 park and has been impressed by continued restoration work. Both sides of the cemetery remain open as active burial grounds, with interments taking place weekly, end quote. As they say, the cemetery now is still an active burial ground, and that's how George Michael was buried there in 2017, but his grave is unmarked. Also, Bob Hoskins rests at Highgate. Oh, and Douglas Adams, the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if you're a fan of that.
Paul's favorite book.
In case you want to visit, they are open every day from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. closed from November to February, and they are closed on Christmas Day and Boxing Day. And if you want to visit the grave of Karl Marx, you need to go to the East Cemetery. For a more kind of macabre Victorian feel, you might want to check out the West Cemetery. Nowadays you can access both parts on a self-guided tour, but you will need to purchase a ticket. And there are areas at the west side that are off limits and can only be visited with a tour guide. You can either just visit one part of Highgate, but if you're planning to visit both sides, just purchase a ticket for the West Cemetery, because the East is included in that one. Also, the best advice is not to go there by car, as parking is very limited. Use public transportation and wear sensible and comfortable shoes. The cemetery, especially the west side, can get pretty muddy at times. I think this is the perfect moment for a little break to talk about the sponsor of this episode, the What Was That Like podcast.
Yeah, What Was That Like is actually a really interesting podcast. Have you ever wondered what it's like to survive a bombing or a shooting? How about what it's like to survive a tsunami, an avalanche, or being crushed by a tree? Tree stuff terrifies me. Every time Paul goes outside with the chainsaw, I get angsty.
Same.
And you know I have all of the episodes on shark attacks, grizzly bear attacks, monkey attacks, and alligator attacks saved. It's fascinating.
Yeah, each week Scott Johnson does a fantastic job listening to someone who has had a unique experience tell the story. Some are thrilling, as Annie mentioned. Some are, of course, quite sad and discuss topics like what was it like to lose loved ones on 9/11. Others are terrifying, such as the person who killed an intruder and the woman who survived an attack by a serial rapist. But others are more lighthearted and uplifting.
Yeah, I've only recently discovered this podcast, and it really is so interesting. I was just listening to the episode where a man who won a lot of money on Wheel of Fortune was talking about it. Paul really wants me to audition for Wheel of Fortune, which is a story for another time. But this episode was fascinating, and I'm going to make Paul listen to it the next time we're driving somewhere. And the host, Scott, is great. He asks exactly the kind of questions that you're wondering. He knows. He asks the questions. He knows how to do interviews. It's great. All the episodes I've listened to also had really good audio quality.
Scott also uses the actual 911 calls when they're part of the story. There's a topic on this show for everyone, so please check it out. What Was That Like can be found on any podcast app, including Spotify, or at the website whatwasthatlike.com. And if you like it, leave him a review. He's gonna love that.
Definitely. Okay, so now it's time to get to the creepy part. Are there any hauntings or similar spooky things happening at Highgate? The answer is yes. There are, of course, many stories surrounding apparitions at Highgate, men in dark robes, a gray or white lady, depending on who you ask, who can be seen running through the cemetery, frantically looking for her children. People also report seeing glowing red eyes in the dark, which... no thank you. They also hear loud screams and wailing sounds that raise the hair on your arms.
I don't like that.
No me gusta. Also, a floating nun is a Highgate regular, and a man with a top hat is another.
I just hope it's a Victorian-era style choice and not the hat man.
Yeah, I don't like the hat man. That's another story for another day. Yeah, and then we have the Highgate vampire.
Dun dun dun.
Bum, bum. I'm scared to hum any kind of music now in case the people come after
Please
us.
Don't.
It is pretty spooky, though, to be honest, and the story goes a little something like this. So it all started in the late 1960s, at a time when Highgate had already closed down after going bankrupt. And as is always the case with creepy, abandoned places all over the world, people who are attracted to the spooky fuckery side of life began to enter the cemetery grounds. Actually, they didn't only enter at Highgate. Signs of people vandalizing graves could be found at several cemeteries. And we're saying vandalized in kind of quotations because mostly it seems like it was harmless. For example, one newspaper article kept talking about how flowers were being rearranged. And okay, that's not great, but it's not nefarious necessarily, right? But not everything, unfortunately, was so benign. Open tombs were found, sarcophagi were opened, remains were disturbed, and one casket was even found with a metal stake in the form of a cross being hammered through the lid and driven through the chest of the body inside, or at least what was left of it. That's not respectful. And so pretty soon, rumors made the rounds. Rumors talking about a young group of followers of the occult who would wander the graveyards at night, practicing rituals. In February of 1970, a young man by the name of David Farrant wrote a letter to the Hampstead and Highgate Express, and the letter goes as follows. Ghostly walks in Highgate. Some nights I walk home past the gates of Highgate Cemetery. On 3 occasions, I have seen what appeared to be a ghost-like figure inside the gates at the top of Swains Lane. The first occasion was on Christmas Eve. I saw a gray figure for a few seconds before it disappeared into the darkness. The second sighting, a week later, was also brief. Last week, the figure appeared only a few yards inside the gates. This time, it was there long enough for me to see it much more clearly, and now I can think of no other explanation than this apparition being supernatural. I have no knowledge in this field, and I would be interested to hear if any other readers have seen anything of this nature. David Farrant, Priestwood Mansions, No. 6. End quote.
Now you might ask yourself who this letter writer was. David Farrant was born in 1946 in Highgate, so he was around the age of 24 when he wrote that letter. On his webpage, davidfarrant.org, it says about his upbringing that opened him up to spiritualism and the occult. Quote, growing up within the oeuvre of the spiritualist movement in post-war London, David was exposed to alternative explanations for the unexplainable from a young age. His mother in particular played a very strong part in his early leaning towards Wicca and the paranormal, and he has credited her at every opportunity. The family home in Highgate's Shepherd's Hill was the haunt of a peculiar entity which seemed to predate the Victorian villa, and David and his childhood friends spent many hours engrossed in local mysteries such as the haunted house on Hampstead Lane, the hooded figure which stalked Swains Lane by night, and the ghost train which passed them one afternoon in a disused tunnel at Highgate Overground Station. David's mother sadly passed away when he was at the tender age of 13, and so began a quest for knowledge which this remarkable woman had ignited in him. Fiercely independent, David traveled across Europe aged only 15 with a few pounds in his pockets and a sleeping bag in a rucksack. The adventures were enough to fill a book, Shadows in the Night, and formed the foundations of a life dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of the unknown. As he came of age, David cut a popular, albeit somewhat eccentric and misunderstood figure in Highgate Village, which was increasingly becoming the center of intensive paranormal activity focused around its famous cemetery. Well known locally before his face became regular front-page material throughout the 1970s, with his pet macaw often perched on his shoulder, he gained the nickname Birdman. While the moniker has vanished over time, Highgate residents' familiarity with their very own vampire hunter that never was endures. End quote. Annie, he had a pet macaw.
I want a macaw. All my fantasies are sort of Dr. Dolittle in nature. He's also, the one photograph that you always see of him, I just pay careful attention to how long the ash on that cigarette is. Like, steady hands, that man. That is one long cigarette ash. All right. In any case, in 1967, the British Psychic and Occult Society was founded, and David became their founding president. So he is walking past Highgate Cemetery, or maybe he was already in there looking for spirits because it's what he was interested in. But he sees this figure 3 times in total, and so he decides to write the letter to the newspaper about it. He also spent a night at the cemetery to try to figure out what the dark shadow was. And indeed, he did encounter the entity. He said he saw it floating above the ground with glowing red, piercing eyes, and that Frent said that he started to feel sick and weak and was icy cold and only regained strength after reciting a few verses from the Kabbalah. Then he wrote another letter to the Ham and High, asking if anyone else had experienced a similar situation. On the 27th of February, 1970, the Ham and High Express prints an article, and it's titled, quote, "Does a Vampire Walk in Highgate?" ?
I love how they write vampire.
Did they write it with a W? PR? All right. So in this article, a man named Sean Manchester, he's president of the British Occult Society, and he explains that he is certain that the dark figure at Highgate Cemetery is not a harmless spirit, but is a vampire. And not just any old vampire. No. It's the vampire king of the undead. He even knows where the vampire came from. So he was a Wallachian nobleman.
So the Walache was part of Romania.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, that's my best guess. This was back in the Middle Ages, and so he was heavily invested in dark magic, and that's what turned him into an undead. And then in the 1700s, his followers brought him and his coffin to England, where they had bought the Vampire King a house in the West End. I'm sorry. This is like, I can't decide if this is the plot of What We Do in the Shadows or The Mummy.
It's also very Dracula.
Yeah, but in the 1700s, to bring him and his coffin to England, where they bought him his own house. Who are these people? All right, so because of this, Highgate Cemetery became his home, and now he has risen again, awakened by the Satanists. I mean, of course. And now he's on the prowl for fresh blood. What are we going to do? And how does Sean Manchester know about all of it anyway? Well, turns out he is, by his own definition, an exorcist and a vampire hunter.
For legal reason, I'd like to add that Mr. Sean Manchester is also a bishop of the Old Catholic Church, whatever that is. I checked, and apparently there are 14,000 Austrians members of the Old Catholic Church.
How is the...
I think they don't accept anything after a certain Vatican Council in 1600 something. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. It seems to be of very much importance to Mr. Manchester that everybody knows he's a bishop. So, on 6th of March 1970, the following article was printed in the Ham and High Express. Content note, as I said before, dead animals are mentioned, but let's all assume they died happily from natural causes in their sleep at an old age, okay?
Yeah.
The article is titled, quote, "Why do the foxes die?"
So there's a little bit of a spoiler alert right there.
What does the fox say?
You can't. They're going to come for us.
The mysterious death of foxes in Highgate Cemetery was this week linked with the theory that a ghost seen in the area might be a vampire. Tobacconist Mr. David Farrand, 24, who first reported seeing the ghost last month, returned to the spot last weekend and discovered a dead fox. Quote, "Several other foxes have also been found dead in the cemetery," end quote, he said at his home in Priestwood Mansion, Arquay Road, Highgate. The quote continues, "The odd thing is, there was no outward sign of how they died. Much remains unexplained, but what I have recently learned all points to the vampire theory as being the most likely answer. Should this be so, I for one am prepared to pursue it, taking whatever means might be necessary so that we can all rest," end quote.
Listen, I'm not saying it's vampires, but it's vampires.
The vampire theory was suggested last week by Mr. Sean Manchester, 25-year-old president of the British Occult Society, who believes that the quote-unquote king vampire of the undead walks again. Mr. Farrand and Mr. Manchester met in the cemetery at the weekend. They are pictured left. Mr. Farrand pointing out the spot where he saw a spectre, and Mr. Manchester with prayer book in hand. Mr. Manchester, when told of the dead foxes, said, quote, "These incidents are just more inexplicable events that seem to complement my theory about a vampire." End quote.
I mean, what are you going to do, Johanna? It's vampires. They have a vampire
It's
problem.
vampires.
Someone
It's
has to
just
take care of
vampires.
business. Why not them?
This is where the story starts to become a bit ambiguous. Basically, there are two versions about who or what the Highgate entity really was. So there's David Farron's and Sean Manchester's versions. Nevertheless, this was a very welcome story for the local newspapers. Last but not least, because vampires were kind of the latest craze in the late 1960s and early 1970s. For example, in the UK, you had the Hammer Films Dracula series, which movie titles like Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, or The Taste of Blood of Dracula. In the US, movies like Billy the Kid vs. Dracula, or The Blood of Dracula's Castle were released. I'm the next Don LaFontaine. This summer.
Coming. He had a thirst for blood.
He had a thirst for blood. Watch a vampire and a kid on this adventure together. A growing friendship.
I just don't understand why a vampire would be hanging out in a cemetery, because there's no fresh blood in a cemetery. It makes no logical sense.
He's sleeping there.
It's just where he lives. It's just his home.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So the media kept printing articles about the Highgate vampire, and Farron and Manchester are pretty much arguing over what the entity is, because Farron does not think it's a vampire. But just to be sure, he can be seen at Highgate with a cross in his hand. Also, apparently one moonlit night, he took it upon himself to search the vampire lair and try to slay the vampire king. He didn't find it. So I'm honestly not entirely sure if he really never believed in the vampire story, or if he did believe it and then kind of stopped believing it later. Or, just like, oh, I never said it was a vampire. I never believed it was a vampire.
He's adamant about it now, yeah, later on.
I mean, he didn't like to be referred as vampire hunter, so
No.
yeah. I also read that he at first thought it's possible that it was a vampire, but that during kind of a seance, he tried to connect with the entity, and then the dark spirit grabbed his throat and kind of tried to strangle him. And from that moment on, he knew it was definitely not a vampire, because,
Definitely not.
vampires are not known for strangling
Never.
someone.
Nope. I mean, they'll come for your neck, but not with their hands.
That's true. It just reminds me of the meme somebody posted, like, that as a kid, we all believed that the teeth of the vampire work like straws, and they suck the blood.
100%. Yes.
So yeah, this story is so twisted, because over time things got added and retold, and then people denied, I never said that, I never did that. It's a little bit hard for us to figure out what is what, really. I mean, I think you can take a deep dive into that story and still not be sure who thought what and believed what.
Well, I'm glad that only one of them really felt like they were a vampire hunter, because I think any number that's greater than one vampire hunter per cemetery is probably too many vampire hunters in one cemetery.
It's creating too much spooky fuckery.
It is. It's too much.
There are all these newspaper articles, and the BBC goes down there and they film and they interview the people and blah. And the audience gets completely invested in the whole thing. And then on Friday, 13th March of 1970, the whole thing absolutely escalates. Hundreds of people make their way to Highgate to hunt for the vampire, and the police are present. They try to stop the people from entering the cemetery, from climbing the walls.
They're like, everybody calm down. There's no vampires.
Yeah, there's just too little police and too many vampire hunters. They are storming the graveyard. People say that there were like 200 to 300 vampire hunters there.
It's not funny. I don't know why I find it so funny.
So during this mass vampire hunt, which is, by the way, the biggest vampire hunt in Britain in the 20th century, you're not going to believe it. It is said that Mr. Manchester found coffins that didn't fit their surroundings. They were newish looking and completely black. And he opened them and placed garlic cloves into the coffins, and then he closed them up again.
That'll teach him.
Some people say that these 200 to 300 vampire hunters caused no damage at all. They were very careful.
Mm-hmm.
But then other accounts talk about broken-in tombs, graffitis on the walls and floors, and it was not great. And this Friday 13th was not the last time that this happened. Over the next weeks and months, people kept coming to the cemetery and grave sites kept getting disturbed. And I think we can all agree that no matter what you believe in, this is real asshole behavior.
It's the worst.
I think it was in late summer, I think August of 1970, when 2 teenage girls found the remains of a kind of mummified woman, decapitated and partially burned, and she was lying right in the middle of one of the pathways. She had been removed from her resting place and her head had been, separated from her body.
Yeah.
Now all of this was starting to get to be too much.
I mean, obviously, this is too much. Believe in vampires all you want, but these are the remains of people's loved ones, people's mothers, fathers, grandparents, great-grandparents. It's so wild to imagine a mob of people swarming a cemetery in search of vampires in relatively recent history. This happened the week before Paul was born. Paul was 1970, right? So, yeah.
Like, that's nothing.
Nothing. Yeah. And because David Farrant had been prominently featured in newspapers, on the television, on the telly, as they say in the UK. And he's talking about the Highgate vampire, all of this information, and of course the police are like, well, we like the look of you, so they arrest him, thinking he's responsible for all of this desecration. But the charges against him were dropped soon after. The interest in the Highgate vampire began to slow down a little bit after that, but neither Farrant nor Manchester would stop looking for the who's and what's of the dark entity that seemed to live somewhere within the cemetery grounds, and they kept going on with their feud. Basically, their entire lives, they would publicly ridicule each other, they would publicly challenge each other to magical duels. I don't think they ever did actually duel each other, did they? I don't think they did.
I don't think, but they always kind of,
threatened it. Like,
threaten to duel each other, yeah.
Right, like, stop teasing us with the one thing everybody really wants already. Duel. Am I wrong? I don't know. They both wrote books, so if you would like to know more about their versions of events, you can read those. We have not read them, but from the summaries we read, I do believe, and please correct us if this is wrong, but Mr. Manchester writes in his book that he did manage to hunt down the vampire, and he killed it, of course, by driving a stake through his heart, and then he declared Highgate Cemetery purged of all vampires.
If it was the vampire king, and he killed him, then all of the other vampires die as well. Or, I mean, that's vampire science.
Yeah, that's Lost Boys style right there. I think that's...
Again, it sounds a lot like Dracula and most Dracula movie variations.
It does. Yeah.
Coincidence? I think not.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to be nice about it, but it's hard. Like, isn't that funny? All the similarities. Huh. All right. So, in 1974, David Farrant was once more arrested and taken to trial. What had happened? There's a little bit to unpack here. So, in 1973, he was arrested after the police found him in an abandoned house. And he wasn't just out with a flashlight or a torch, as he would say in the UK, just sort of quietly looking around. No, he was found naked next to the remains of some kind of fire that was now a pile of embers on a plate. He explained to police, whilst naked, I assume, that he was doing a Wiccan cleansing ceremony in order to rid the place of ghosts. So I imagine like a sage burning sort of scenario maybe, but he's naked. And can we just say, naked time and flames, not always the best combination. Okay. So he's arrested, but the judge gives him a warning. He's didn't really hurt anything, so he's let go. However, a friend of his was also arrested around the same time, and David alleges that the police were rough with him and mistreating his friend. So David did what any good friend in this situation would do. He went and had a couple of voodoo effigies made, and then he mailed them to the police with a letter included signed by him, which he sent via mail, the kind of mail that requires a signature to show your parcel has been received. So
here's your voodoo doll. Can you sign, please?
Right?
Would you be that kind of friend to send voodoo dolls to my enemies?
Yes. Yes, good. I am. Yeah.
You're a good friend.
Yep. They're just going to get hair in the mail and they won't understand what it's about. It's just the way to keep your head down, right? Like after being arrested.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he claims that the effigies were only there to protect his friend, but police allege they were of a threatening nature. Regardless, now it does actually get worse, because a couple of months later, some poor son of a bitch living in the general vicinity of the cemetery, goes out to get into his car to head into work, and oh, wouldn't you know it, there's a headless corpse behind the wheel of his car. I think the corpses are headless. This is a brief aside, but I think all these headless corpses are because when they were grave robbed, they'd probably just naturally separated, right?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody was doing
Mostly,
anything.
I think that's true. They just snap off, yeah.
Exactly. So this poor guy, there's a headless corpse behind the wheel of his car. And I have so many questions, but there just isn't that much information out there. But he calls the police, and who do you think the police are now going to be questioning? David Farrant, that's who. So he's brought back in for questioning, and he denies having anything to do with desecrating a corpse. And in a real who are these people moment, a friend of the man who had the corpse in his car comes forward, and he's like, "Hi, sorry, it was me. I put the headless corpse in my friend's car." Because that's a normal thing people do, right?
Jesus.
I don't.
Oh, God.
Who are these people? But despite the third-party confession, Farrant was still found to be guilty of threatening police with the voodoo dolls and desecrating and damaging the cemetery. They found photographs in his possession of damaged graves, and those photos, the police felt, were clearly things he had destroyed. Can you even imagine what we would be found guilty of if they looked at the photos we have on our phones? I can't.
They would probably think I'm the Zodiac.
Yeah, straight to the guillotine with both of us, right?
Yeah.
It's terrible. And in the end, he was sentenced to 4 years for these crimes. And while he freely admitted sending the voodoo dolls as protection to his friend, he denied every other allegation and blamed the grave desecration on who else? Satanists.
I honestly think this prison sentence is a bit rough. But my best guess is that his notoriety and his previous accusations played part in this sentence for putting a corpse in a car that he didn't and for sending out voodoo dolls. 5 years.
Yeah, I think they maybe needed to make an example out of him because
definitely.
Too many people were messing with bodies.
Yeah.
You can't.
That's so sad. That really upsets me. Imagine it's our loved ones. I mean, we lost people.
Yeah.
Anyway, David Farrant, he could leave prison after 2.5 years, and he and Bishop Sean Manchester kept up their rivalry until 2019, because that's the year that Mr. Farrant died at age 73. Of course, there are still people who are interested in the story of the Highgate vampire. I mean, hello, what are we doing here right now? And over the decades, there were other people who had come forward saying they encountered the tall, dark stranger. The tall, dark shadow figure. They talk about the scary experiences, how they felt ice cold, how watches stopped working. And one girl in 1971 even claimed that she had been attacked by the entity. And see, that's where I'm like, where was ever the reason for believing that this shadow was a vampire? I mean, wouldn't there be a lot of victims? I mean, I don't know. Just because of the foxes, I doubt that the vampire king would feast only on foxes and rats like Louis de Pontulac before he meets Claudia. So, let's look at the other explanations for the Highgate vampire entity. A ghost of one of the people who were placed there to rest? Or is it a way older spirit? David Farrant considered it a possibility that satanic rituals had awakened an old spirit connected to the energetic lines that run through the grounds.
I mean, it's an interesting theory.
It is.
That doesn't involve a vampire, but I don't know.
We can both agree we believe in a lot of things, but vampires are not high on our list.
No, I wish they were. Yeah, I'm a fan of vampires. I like the idea for a couple of reasons, I think. I love the idea of having someone you love that will never die. That is appealing. And also, I love the idea of there being a way to, get around all of the autoimmune disease stuff. So, if I could be made a vampire and not ever deal with, this pain or whatever again, I would 1000% give up daylight and drink blood. I'd be fine with that.
But you would have to attack people and drink their blood.
Would I have to, though? I don't know.
Yeah. How would you survive? I mean, you have to feast.
Yeah. But what if you just nibbled?
Yeah, but you still have to attack them.
Do you?
Even if you don't kill them.
That would be hard for me. I'm a very non-confrontational person.
You wouldn't live off animals. I mean, you wouldn't go and bite rabbits.
No, I would only do it if I could be the
Exactly.
kind of vampire that has, you can just take a small amount from people, or buy blood from the blood bank, or like a Sookie Stackhouse True Blood kind of situation. I'd be down for that. That'd be all right. I don't know. But that is the story of the Highgate vampire. What we thought was going to be a really straightforward haunting case turned out to be this really huge feud between a couple of occultists and even a mass vampire hunt on Friday the 13th. I don't know that you could ask for much more than that in a palate cleanser of an episode, right?
It's just, there's everything you need in here.
Yeah.
Everything you need.
It's good stuff.
Do you have something good?
I realize that this episode is going to drop on 420, so I hope everyone celebrating is having a good day. A cannabis could be my something good. The Botox for my migraines has kicked in, but I don't know. So the weather we have been having this spring it's all over the place. I'm really jealous of migraine sufferers who have a trigger they can avoid, like alcohol or caffeine or cheese. I mean, it would be awful to have to give those things up, all of those things, but I would if I could make a difference. Mine are like weather, certain smells, and then occasionally high-pitched sounds. So it's really hard stuff to avoid. You know what I mean? It's
Of course, yeah.
It's just been a killer. Also, congratulations to everyone who ran the Boston Marathon this week. It was a perfect day for those who were returning to the race because after COVID, I think the 2020 marathon was virtual. It was the first time there wasn't one. And then in the fall, they did it in the fall for 2021. So this was a return to the usual date, and they had a beautiful, beautiful day for it.
My something good is that the 6th and final season of Better Call Saul just came out. And I was waiting for it for so long, but now I have to wait a little bit longer. Please, nobody spoil anything for me, because I have to wait until Philip comes home for his vacation in 2 weeks. We're going to watch it together.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm really excited for that one. I love that show.
Yeah, it's a great show. Really good.
Please, if you liked this very bizarre episode, go to your favorite podcast app that you use and check out if you can leave us a rating and or review. We're getting so close to Annie's goal, which is 1,000 US ratings. Thank you for that.
Not that we don't still appreciate all the outside the US ratings, because we do very much.
Yes, all of them. Yeah. We love them all. And also, please don't forget, go to podcastmagazine.com, I think, Hot 50, and vote for us. You have 1 vote per day for your 3 favorite podcasts, and would be so great if your favorite international podcast would be one of your votes. I really want us to be in the top 10 at least once. Thank you.
Yeah, I support that dream, definitely. We would appreciate it. And if you are trying to find out more information about us, stop it, you weird stalker. No, I'm just kidding. You can find us at freshhellpodcast.com, of course. And you will find links there to our merch. Our email address is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com. Our website will have information on our P.O. box, as well as information on our Patreon. You can go as well to patreon.com and search for Fresh Hell Podcast. You'll find us there. Do we know? We have the date, don't we? The next game night for our Murder Tier patrons
It's 21st.
is the 21st. 2 days.
Yeah,
so
21st.
That's going to be...
We're both going to be there.
Super fun. Can't wait. And what else?
That's it. Please tell your pets we said hi. Your foxes, your bats, if you have some. Your dogs, your cats, your guinea pigs, your axolotls, your snakes, your bugs, your, geckos. You know what? I was just thinking, one day we're gonna be made responsible for somebody trying to say hi to a grizzly bear.
Don't say hi to wild animals. Leave them alone.
I mean, you can say hi from very far.
Yeah, from like
far. Just yell it into the forest and go.
Yeah, don't... Yeah, pets, not wild animals.
Yeah. Be kind to your fellow human being. Give them the benefit of the doubt at least once. We're all stressed out. And you are stressed out too, probably. So please also be kind to yourself.
Yep, that's important. We're going to just keep adding shit to the end of this episode until there's like an extra hour at the end. Surprise! But not today. Today, we just want to remind you that, as always, tough times get better. And if you are going through hell,
Keep going. Tschüss.
Bye-bye.